The wind died first. That was the thing Aldrich Voss noticed before anything else. The way the constant gnawing whistle of the Vareth Range simply stopped, as if the mountain had pressed a hand over its own mouth. After 3 weeks at altitude, the silence hit him like a physical blow. He pulled up short on the narrow trail and stood still, breath fogging in the sudden hush, his pencil frozen halfway across the page of his open survey journal. Button felt it too. The mule had been reliable for 11 years through conditions that would have broken a lesser animal. Rock slides, whiteouts, one genuinely terrible encounter with a frost bear outside the Greyvale Pass. Button did not spook. Button did not stop without being told. But the mule had planted all 4 hooves into the snow with the specific and immovable stubbornness of an animal that has made a final decision about something, and no amount of Aldrich clicking his tongue or pressing his heels was going to change that. "Easy," Aldrich murmured, more out of habit than expectation. "Easy, old man." Button's eyes had gone wide and white at the edges, fixed on something above and ahead. His nostrils were working fast, pulling in short, sharp breaths. Every muscle in his compact body had gone rigid. Aldrich followed his gaze up the slope. The snowfield above the trail was steep and clean, catching the last gray light of the afternoon on its unbroken surface. He had surveyed it 2 days prior and noted its gradient in careful ink. A 30-degree face, stable, no significant avalanche risk. He knew exactly what it looked like, which was why it took him a suspended moment to understand what he was seeing when the snow moved, not slid, not broke, not fell, breathed. The whole upper face of the slope seemed to rise and shift, like something enormous had been lying against it and was now choosing to stand. Then the ridgeline cracked open against the pale sky, and they came over it one by one. Sill. He had read about dragons. Every cartographer who worked the northern ranges had at least a shelf's worth of field guides, bestiary excerpts, and second-hand accounts collected from border town libraries and the rambling testimonies of hunters who had survived close encounters. Aldrich had read them all, the way a careful man reads anything that might one day save his life. He knew the taxonomy, the territorial ranges, the rough behavioral patterns of 6 distinct dragon species documented in the Vareth literature. Not one of those books had prepared him for this. They were albino, every single one, without exception. Not the silver-white of the ice dragons catalogued in Fennec's northern bestiary, which carried a metallic sheen that caught light like armor. This was something different, something deeper. Their scales held a flat, to chalky whiteness that seemed to absorb the evening light rather than reflect it, as if each dragon was its own small absence in the landscape. And their eyes, pale pink, almost colorless, catching the dusk with a faint luminous quality, were nothing like the gold or green or ember red that every account he had ever read described. These creatures had never been written about. He was quite possibly the first human being to ever stand this close to them and remain standing. The largest one, a female, positioned at the front of the group with the quiet authority of something that did not need to announce itself, was easily 50 feet from nose to tail. Her wingspan, currently folded against her body, would have shadowed half an acre if she opened it. The muscles along her shoulders were thick as old oak roots. Yet one swipe of her foreleg would have ended Aldrich Voss and Button both before either of them felt anything. She didn't swipe. None of them moved. 19 albino dragons stood on the ridge above him in the windless cold and looked down at him with those pale, ancient eyes and the word that surfaced in Aldrich's. The others didn't move. That was the detail that lodged itself in Aldrich's mind and refused to leave. The 18 dragons remaining on the ridgeline with a stillness so absolute they might have been carved there, pale monuments against the darkening sky. No shifting of weight, no spreading of wings, no sound beyond the faint rhythmic pulse of their breath misting in the cold air. They held the ridge the way a held breath holds, with intention, with effort, with the specific quality of something being carefully controlled. They were giving her room to work. The large female descended the slope alone, and she did it slowly, deliberately, each massive forelimb placed with a care that struck Aldrich as almost theatrical in its precision, like as if she was performing smallness, performing non-threat, for the benefit of the tiny creature standing frozen on the trail below. She angled her body sideways as she came down, never pointing herself directly at him, never presenting the full, intimidating width of her chest and shoulders. She knew exactly how large she was. She was trying to make it easier for him to stay. Aldrich's boots had grown roots. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way that he usually only experienced during near-death situations, which he was beginning to suspect this might still qualify as, regardless of the dragon's apparent intentions. Button had gone so rigid beside him that the mule had essentially become a piece of furniture. Neither of them ran. Some dim, ancient part of Aldrich's brain seemed to understand, below the level of conscious thought, though that running would be the wrong answer. So he stayed, and she came down. She stopped 10 feet from him, close enough that he could see the faint tracery of darker white patterning beneath her scales, like frost on glass. And then she did something that knocked the air out of his chest more completely than any threat could have managed. She lowered her head, all the way down. Chin-T. He would think about that moment for the rest of his life. Not the dragons, though they would occupy a permanent and bewildering corner of his memory until his last breath. Not the mountain, not the cold, not the way the silence had swallowed everything whole. What he would think about, in the quiet hours and the long winters that followed, was the precise instant his mouth opened and produced words before his brain had issued any instruction to do so. All right, show me what's wrong. 6 words. Spoken in the same low, even tone he used to talk Button through thunderstorms. Not commanding, not heroic, not even particularly calm if you listened closely enough to hear the slight unevenness underneath. Just 6 words falling out of him like they had been waiting behind his teeth the whole time, as natural and inevitable as breathing. And he was a cartographer. That was the full extent of what he was. A man who walked into places other people had stopped paying attention to and wrote down what he found there. He had no special courage. He had simply spent enough years in genuinely dangerous terrain that danger had lost some of its novelty. He had no gifts with animals, no arcane knowledge of draconic behavior, no bloodline touched by old magic, the way heroes in stories always seemed to conveniently discover about themselves at moments like this. He was 42 years old, slightly stiff in the left knee since a bad fall 3 winters back, currently in possession of approximately a week's worth of dried rations and 1 emotionally compromised mule. He was not the right person for whatever this was. And yet, had he looked into those pale pink eyes, eyes that held something he could not name precisely but recognized the shape of, the way you recognize grief in a face even when you don't know the language the person speaks. And the idea of turning around and walking back down the mountain presented itself to him as a genuine moral impossibility. Not because they moved at night, which should have been terrifying. The Vareth Range after dark was not a place any experienced mountain traveler chose to be on foot and unguided. The trails that were merely difficult in daylight became genuinely lethal in the dark. Edges that disappeared into nothing, snowpack that looked solid and wasn't, crevasse fields hidden under thin crusts of ice that could hold a boot print but not a body. Aldrich had made camp by sundown every single day of his 3 weeks up here, without exception, because surviving the Vareth Range required a specific kind of disciplined humility about what the mountain became after the light left. He was now walking through it at night, led by a dragon he had met 20 minutes ago. Button had graduated from pure terror to a brittle, a exhausted resignation that Aldrich found oddly relatable. The mule walked because walking was what he did, placing each hoof with the careful deliberateness of an animal that had decided to trust the process purely because panicking had not improved the situation. The female, Aldrich had already begun thinking of her as something, some name he hadn't yet settled on, moved ahead of him at a pace calibrated precisely to his. Not her pace, his. She checked back regularly, those pink eyes finding him in the darkness, with an ease that reminded him, uncomfortably, that he was the least equipped creature in this particular group. But it was the others that undid him. The 18 dragons on the flanks were not simply accompanying him. They were working. He realized it gradually. The way you realize something that was always true but required enough evidence to accept. A subtle pressure from the left that angled him away from ground that looked identical to the ground he'd been walking on. A gentle convergence from the right that narrowed his path around a section of snow that gave slightly under Button's hoof before firm earth caught them. He stopped and looked back at... He smelled it before he saw it. Not the valley itself. That revealed itself gradually as the trail crested a low ridge and dropped into a sheltered bowl of land, wide enough to feel like a different world from the exposed face of the mountain. What he smelled first was the ghost of what the valley had been. A faint mineral warmth underneath the cold, the sulfuric edge of geothermal water that lingered in the rock and soil long after the source had gone. The way a room still smells of wood smoke hours after the fire has died. Something warm had lived here once. He could see the evidence of it everywhere as the pale pre-dawn light began to separate the shapes around him. The ground nearest the valley's center had a particular quality of earth that only formed around long-term geothermal activity. Dark, mineral-rich, on the kind of soil that held heat and released it slowly, that supported growth in places that should have been too cold and too high for anything to take root. It had supported growth here once. The skeletal remains of low scrub vegetation stood in dry clusters across the valley floor, stems brittle and pale, root systems exposed where the cracking earth had pulled back from them like a tide going out. The ground itself told the story plainly if you knew how to read it. Aldrich knew how to read it. He walked the valley floor slowly, surveying from instinct, eyes moving in the systematic pattern of a man who had spent 20 years learning to let terrain speak. Now the crack lines in the earth radiated from the valley's center outward in a pattern that indicated subsurface drying, the kind that happened when underground water changed course and the soil above it slowly lost its moisture and its warmth from below. He followed the crack lines toward the eastern edge of the valley, where the rock face dropped away sharply, and found what he was looking for. The channel was recent. 2 seasons, maybe 3 at the outside. A section of the east. He almost missed it. The nest sat in a natural depression near the valley's center, low enough that the surrounding rock partially concealed it from any angle but the immediate approach. It was not marked, not guarded, not announced in any way. The dragons had not led him directly to it. They had brought him to the valley and let him walk, let him read the terrain and follow his own understanding toward the thing they most needed him to see. As if presenting it outright would have been too much. As if they needed him to find it himself so that when he did, he would know it was real. He rounded a shelf of dark rock and stopped. 23 eggs. They rested in a shallow bowl of earth that had clearly been shaped and maintained with great care over a long period of time. The edges smoothed, and the interior packed with a fine mineral soil that would have once been kept perpetually warm by the geothermal heat rising through the ground beneath it. Pale as their parents, each egg was roughly the size of a large grain sack, ovoid and slightly irregular in shape, their surfaces carrying the same matte, chalky quality as the scales of the adults surrounding him. In another context, in better light, They might have been beautiful. Right now, they were cold. He could see it without touching them, the way the frost had begun to form on the uppermost surfaces of the eggs nearest the edge of the bowl, the way the earth around the nest had lost the dark mineral richness he had noticed in the valley's center and had taken on the pale, dry quality of ground that no longer had anything moving beneath it. He crossed to the nest slowly, as aware of the absolute stillness of every dragon in the valley at his back, and crouched beside the nearest egg. He pulled off his glove. He pressed his bare palm flat against the surface. The cold hit him immediately, deep and pervasive, the cold of something that had been losing heat for a long time and had lost most of He had never been the kind of man who waited for permission. That was not courage. He was careful to make that distinction in his own mind, crouched in the cold dirt with his journal open across his knee and his pencil moving in slow, deliberate strokes across the page. Courage implied a choice made despite fear. What Aldrich felt right now was not the absence of fear, but the presence of something louder, something that had crowded the fear into a smaller room and shut the door on it. Not bravery, just clarity. The particular clarity that arrived when a problem presented itself in sufficiently concrete terms and his mind, almost against his will, began solving it. He understood exactly what was being asked of him. Not in the way of a formal request. No dragon had handed him a contract. No terms had been negotiated. But the valley had told him its story plainly, and the nest had told him the rest, and the sum of those two truths produced a third truth that sat in his chest with the simple, immovable weight of obligation. The water needed to come back. The heat needed to come back. 23 lives were running a deficit they could not sustain much longer, and he was the only thing standing in the gap between what the mountain had broken and what it needed to be. One man. He took inventory with the unsentimental practicality of someone who had survived 20 years in difficult terrain by knowing exactly what he had and refusing to pretend otherwise. Surveying tools, compass, measuring rope, gradient gauge, the good steel ruler he had carried since his apprenticeship, journal and pencils, 3 of them, but which mattered more than most people would understand. A week of dried rations, perhaps 9 days if he was disciplined about it. One bone-handled knife of no particular engineering significance. One mule of considerable stubbornness and proven reliability. No masonry experience. No engineering credentials. No reinforcements coming from anywhere. He worked the way he always worked. Methodically, quietly, talking to himself. It was a habit his first guildmaster had tried to break him of, back when he was 19 and newly apprenticed and still cared what other people thought of his process. Professionals don't mutter, the old man had told him, with the particular authority of someone who had never spent 3 weeks alone on a mountainside. Aldrich had nodded respectfully and continued muttering, because the habit was not affectation, it was function. Saying the numbers out loud made them real. Narrating the terrain as he walked it locked the relationships between features into his memory with a permanence that silent observation never quite achieved. So he walked the valley for 6 hours and he talked, low and steady, to no one in particular. Gradient here. It's dropping east-northeast at roughly 4 degrees. Water would chase that naturally if given the opening. Rock composition along the western berm looks consolidated. Good compression strength could bear significant lateral load without secondary fracture. The fault line in the northern face runs shallower than the eastern collapse. Different stress pattern, probably stable, but worth noting. Distance from the fractured section to the nest depression. He paced it twice, counted carefully, noted the number. Workable. Difficult, but workable. The dragons watched him the entire time. All 19, positioned around the valley with that same deliberate stillness he had first encountered on the ridge. Some sat on the rock outcroppings along the valley walls. Some had settled on the ground near the valley's perimeter. The female remained near the nest as she had since he'd found it. her presence there so constant that he had stopped registering it as something separate from the nest itself. She was simply part of that picture now, inseparable from it. None of them followed him as he worked. That was the detail he kept returning to. The fire was small, just enough to read by. He had built it against a flat-faced boulder near the valley's western edge, where the rock would reflect the heat back toward him, and the light wouldn't bleed far enough to bother anyone. An old habit from years of solo fieldwork in territories where drawing attention after dark was inadvisable. The dragons presumably didn't need the consideration, but the habit was too ingrained to break, and there was something grounding about the routine of it, the familiar smell of the small amount of fuel he carried, the particular warmth of a fire built correctly in cold air, the way the light made his journal pages glow amber. He had been working for 6 hours without stopping. The plan that had emerged across those hours was not beautiful. He was aware of that. Looking at the pages now with the critical eye he applied to all his own work. A trained engineer would have found it rough. An architect would have called it agricultural. It had none of the elegance that proper infrastructure design aspired to, no clean lines, no optimized angles, no sophisticated accounting for long-term maintenance or structural refinement. What it had was honesty. Geothermal water was, at its core, just water. And water followed gravity with a fidelity that no other force in nature quite matched. Patient, persistent, utterly indifferent to the obstacles between it and the lowest available point. It didn't need to be coaxed or convinced. It needed to be shown. Given a path that cost it less energy than the current path, it would take that path every single time, without exception, and because that was simply what water did. The rock slide had given the water a new path 2 seasons ago, a lower gradient running east toward the cliff. All Aldrich needed to do was give it a path that was lower still, running back toward the valley's center where the nest depression sat at the natural low point of the bowl. He needed to redirect, not force. He named her on the second day. It happened without ceremony. No decision made, no moment of deliberate christening. He had been standing at the northern fault line in the gray morning light, trying to communicate to her through gesture and repetition where the first large displacement needed to happen, and he had reached out without thinking and touched the side of her jaw to redirect her attention from the rock he was pointing at to the specific section of that rock he needed moved, and he had said her name as naturally as if he had always known it. Maret. She had gone still under his hand for just a moment, not flinching, not threatening, simply registering, and then she had turned her great pale head and looked at the section of rock he was indicating and moved it, exactly where he had pointed, not approximately, and not close enough. Exactly. He had stood in the displaced rock dust and stared at the result, and then written in his journal, in the margin beside that day's work notes, in small letters, "She understands precision." Then he had underlined it, because underlining was what he did when something was more important than it initially appeared, and he didn't want to forget it later. The days built on each other with the grim, absorbing momentum of hard physical work. He fell into a rhythm that he recognized from the most demanding surveys of his career, the kind of total immersion where the problem became the entire world, and everything outside it receded to irrelevance. He woke before light and was at the fault line by first gray. He worked until he couldn't read his own handwriting by firelight. He ate mechanically, slept heavily, and rose again. The dragons matched him. That was the thing that struck him repeatedly throughout those 11 days, striking him fresh each time as if he hadn't already been struck by it a dozen times before. They matched his pace without being asked to. When he pushed longer hours, they stayed with him. He was asleep when it happened. Not deeply. He had not slept deeply in 11 days, his rest a shallow, functional thing that kept him operational without ever fully releasing him from the problem. He was aware, even in sleep, of the valley around him the way a sailor is aware of the sea. Not consciously, not with attention, but with the background vigilance of someone whose survival had long been tied to reading an environment correctly. So when the mountain changed, he felt it before he was awake. It came through the ground first. Not a tremor, nothing so dramatic as that. A settling, a deep, structural relaxation in the rock beneath him, the sound and sensation of something finding its proper position after a long time spent in the wrong one. And it moved through the valley floor and up through the bedroll and into his bones with the slow, resonant quality of a bell struck softly in a large room. And he was sitting upright with his eyes open before the sound had finished traveling. The valley was different. He knew it immediately. The way you know a room has changed while you slept in it, not by any single identifiable thing, but by the composite of everything, the whole picture subtly and fundamentally altered. The air carried something it hadn't carried before. That faint mineral warmth he had smelled on the first night, the ghost of what the valley had been, was no longer a ghost. It was present, thin still, tentative, but real in a way that ghosts were not. He was out of his bedroll and moving before he had consciously decided to move. And the eastern channel was still running. He had not blocked it, had not tried to, his design working with the water's nature rather than against it. But it was running less. He could hear the difference from 30 feet away, the volume reduced to something closer to a trickle. The bulk of the geothermal flow having found the new path he had spent 11 days carving for it and taken that path with the quiet. He didn't plan to sit down. He had been moving for 11 days with the driven, forward-leaning momentum of a man who understood that stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant acknowledging the full weight of everything he had been carrying since the night 19 white dragons came over a ridge and changed the shape of his life without asking permission. His body had been a tool for 11 days, fueled, maintained, directed toward the problem. And now the problem was solved, and his body made the decision for him, his legs simply folding beneath him until he was sitting in the warming earth beside the nest, with his back against a low rock and his journal still open in his lap, and no particular destination left to move toward. He sat. And the valley was doing something around him that he had no precise technical language for, though he had spent 20 years developing precise technical language for the behavior of terrain. It was warming, yes, that was the factual description. The geothermal heat returning to the soil, the air temperature at ground level rising by increments that his gradient gauge could have measured. But that was not really what the valley was doing. What the valley was doing was remembering. The particular quality of stillness that settled over it in the hour after the water found its channel was not the dead stillness of a place that had given up. It was the stillness of a place that had come back to itself, the specific peace of return, of restoration, of something resuming its proper shape after a long time spent distorted. And he felt it in his own chest in a way that surprised him. Marit came to him quietly. No announcement, no drama. She simply crossed the valley floor with that same deliberate, considered movement he had come to know over 11 days, and settled beside him with the slow, massive care of something that understood its own size and chose, consciously, to make itself companionable. He had not planned to stay beyond the 12th day. The work was done. The water was running. The eggs were warm. By any reasonable accounting of the situation, Aldrich Voss had fulfilled whatever obligation those pale pink eyes on a dark mountainside had pressed him into, and the sensible thing, the professional thing, the thing a man with unfinished survey commissions and a mule to feed and a life waiting 4 days south of here, was to pack his kit, load button, and begin the long walk back down. He told himself this on the morning of the 13th day while he was making his small fire and boiling water for the bitter trail tea he had been drinking every morning for 20 years. He was still there on the 14th day. He could not entirely explain it, and he didn't try very hard. And the valley had a quality in those days after the water returned that he found difficult to leave, a settling warmth, a gradual greening at the edges of the dead scrub as the soil moisture returned and the first tentative signs of recovery began to show themselves. He told himself he was observing, gathering data, completing his survey of a geologically significant site. He wrote careful notes. He measured the temperature of the returning geothermal flow at 3 points along its new channel and recorded the gradient with professional thoroughness. He was also simply happy to be there, which was a thing he was less careful about writing down. The deer appeared on the morning of the 13th day. He had emerged from his tent to find it laid outside with a precision that suggested considerable care, positioned neatly, undamaged beyond what the kill itself required, presented rather than simply left. He had stood looking at it for a long moment in the early light, understanding what it was and feeling the understanding settle into him with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. They had hunted for him, not because he was hungry exactly, his rations. The morning he left, the valley was green at its edges. Not fully, not the lush, settled growth that would come in a season or two when the geothermal warmth had fully reclaimed the soil and the scrub vegetation had re-established itself properly along the valley floor. But the first green, the tentative pioneering green of things that had been waiting underground for conditions to change, was pushing through the softened earth in thin, hopeful lines along the southern-facing rock faces where the warmth pooled first. He noted it in his journal with a precise, professional entry. Then he stood looking at it for considerably longer than a professional entry required, because he was allowed to, and because some things deserved to be looked at. Button was loaded and ready, exhibiting the particular energy of an animal that had correctly identified that they were finally going home and was prepared to maintain a brisk pace for as long as it took to get there. Aldrich had packed the slate map with more care than he had packed anything in 20 years of field work, wrapped in his spare shirt, nested between the stiffest sections of his journal pack, secured against the possibility of every disaster he could imagine, and several he probably couldn't. He said goodbye to the valley the way he said goodbye to all the places that had mattered, quietly, without ceremony, with one long last look that tried to hold as much as a look could hold. Then he turned south and walked. Marit followed him. Not the whole herd. They remained in the valley, in the warming home that was slowly, stubbornly returning to itself. It just her, pacing at a distance that felt considered, that felt like the distance between escorting and accompanying, between guarding and simply being present for the last part of something. They walked together through the high mountain terrain for 2 hours without exchanging anything that could be called communication. Just the sound of his boots,